Invasion Audiobook, Parts 20 and 21. Part 20. The men were now in dire need of fuel and emerged from their bunkers to head out to conduct a recon and, if possible, a raid for fuel. The city was totally locked down by this point, and extremely difficult to infiltrate, as Ann Arbor was by this point heavily patrolled by paramilitary Chinese PAP forces from the two light armored brigades, as well as KPA troops of their local mechanized infantry brigade, also in Ann Arbor. Joseph, enraged at what had, Jacob, enraged at what had occurred in the forest encounter with the PAP, as it pertained to his family being either taken or killed, to his knowledge, drastically wanted revenge for it, as he had spent the remainder of day 2 of the invasion training with the others in basic small unit tactics with the other men of the force that had rescued he and the other refugees, and what few remaining guardsmen of the refugee protection forces had managed to escape the battlefield with the other mixed American forces who had retreated from another area in the vicinity, who they themselves had ran into the battle space where the refugees and their protectors were bogged down by the PAP assault conducted by 2 of its companies. It was now incumbent upon Jacob to assist his rescuers in their endeavors, including obtaining supplies to continue to weather the storm brought on by the enormous invading armies of the Sino-Russian coalition forces. The plan was to proceed upon all-terrain vehicles towards the edge of the current area of the forest in which the mixed American forces were currently in hiding, in order to then leave them behind and proceed on foot to a suburban area whereby they would seek out enemy supplies if a light enemy force could be found during such a recon and force mission, which would morph into a supply raid were it even possible to do so. Light enemy forces meant anything under a company in terms of strength and size, such as perhaps a platoon-sized force, or if it were even feasible or realistic, even anything smaller, such as a individual squad or so, though highly unlikely, as it were, to even occur that way. The Chinese PAP forces within this particular AO of theirs had since spread out on reconnaissance and hunting operations of their own to cleanse the remainder of their AO of any remaining pockets of resistance, as they'd already by and large brought the entire area beneath their yoke of control, and in addition to this have committed by this point immense amounts of atrocities on the local population whenever found in hiding, or wherever they had directly challenged the PAP and or KPA forces, whether in the reactionary or more organized sense of armed resistance. Jacob locked and loaded his QBZ-95 rifle that had earlier been given to him, and accompanied Tony by jumping in the back seat of the four-wheeler all-terrain vehicle of which Tony operated. Sitting back to back to watch the rear sector behind the ATV, Joseph would scan his sector to cover what would ordinarily be blind spots, which otherwise would be unseen with only a driver and no one sitting in the back seat. Tactics would be of a hit-and-run style if intercepted whilst upon their ATVs, but upon leaving their vehicles would be camouflaging them with pine branches before departing on foot the rest of the way, on what could end up being a long patrol involving scouring homes and other abandoned properties and businesses for supplies and any potential quantities of fuels, or perhaps ambushing any potential small formations of Chi-Com and or North Korean forces of the KPA. That was the overarching goal of conducting such an operation. And anyone with even a basic understanding of military operations was already conducting similar all throughout the land. That is, anyone still free or among the living at this point. The situation had already drastically deteriorated to the point to where the American military had been formally routed everywhere, with nothing but very small pockets left by day 3 that were even still offering any sort of organized resistance. Unbeknownst to the whole land, as communications between regions and even the smallest of localities did not exist since day number 1, due to the gouging out of America's eyes and ears with the combo of anti-satellite weapons, cyber attacks, and even electronic warfare systems as an added redundancy against any sort of emergency backup systems that may have had an opportunity of surviving the two former, by which the latter would be there to pick up the slack. Thus, no communications, no organization, or coordination any longer existed, causing it all to rapidly fall apart. It was dark, early morning of day 3 of the invasion, when the group set out upon their mission. Night operations were the best of all to carry out by far, even though the Chinese and Russians owned the night. But in daytime, it was vastly even easier to be noticed than it was at night by night vision and IR equipment. Regardless of how effective night vision and IR gear was, it was still drastically more clunky than not using it at all, such as during the day. This, despite the fact that the newest designs of such were much less so than their predecessors. However, on aircraft and helos, as well as in ground vehicles and on robotic equipment and upon drones, this wasn't a factor, as both IR and night vision capabilities were built into these items. But for the ground troops, it was far more efficient to operate during the daytime, as aiming rifles and other small arms was made much easier without having to have any type of optical equipment potentially throwing off such, even if this was barely the case. It made a difference as at longer ranges, as even a several millimeters off of one's aim made a difference the further down range the rounds traveled, due to having anything even barely obstructing such as the optical equipment. The men drove slow and deliberately through the forest, headed east now from their former camp and bunker site northwest of the city of Ann Arbor in the forest. Essentially, the objective would be to scour the northwestern suburban areas outside of the city, and depending upon security, the men wouldn't travel too far off the beaten path away from their hidden all-terrain vehicles on the edges of the woodlines, beneath the pine branch camouflaging to disguise from IR equipment, as the heat signatures given by the metals and engines upon shutting them off would make them stick out like sore thumbs otherwise. Also, night vision would pick up the vehicle's outlines without adequate amounts of branches being used to cover them up. Quietly, the ATVs continued, with none of the men saying a single word, maintaining the best noise discipline as was possible in order to be able to listen for anything suspicious within the route that the men now traveled upon. It wouldn't be easy to hear any approaching enemies, but the engines of enemy vehicles would sound drastically noisier than did the ATVs as they moved slowly through the forests. Soon, the men began to reach their destination. Tony carried an AR for this mission, as well as some hand grenades taken earlier in the invasion at some point, with other men equipped with a random assortment of different small arms, their own, and some captured from deceased Chinese or North Korean troops, along with a few having either grenades, Molotovs, and even two with captured rocket-propelled grenade systems having had been acquired from either deceased KPA or PAP troops, as both had their own designs of such systems, which could use the same ammo types, as they were essentially a standardized Eastern light anti-armor or anti-personnel weapon, and easy and cheap to mass produce in enormous, unimaginable quantities. For their level of effectiveness overall, it was easy to understand why China, Russia, and North Korea, among others, had these weapons in such massive quantities. It was similar to how America had the cheap and simple AT-4s as their own mass quantity anti-armor weaponry, despite it being not like an RPG, but basically a recoilless anti-tank shell that could be shoulder-fired. There, of course, were many other drastically more potent anti-tank rocket and missile systems, but the RPGs were highly common among basic infantry types of forces, as it gave enemy infantry the ability to offer a higher volume of anti-armor capabilities against any sorts of lighter armor vehicles, as opposed to main battle tanks, which RPGs had essentially no real effect upon, save the newer models such as perhaps the Russian Vampir and similar others, which, if scoring a hit on the top or back, had a real chance at destroying an Abrams. The anti-tank missiles, such as the Russian Kornet or the Chinese Ch1nese Red Arrow, were very powerful anti-tank systems, which have already proven their effectiveness upon main battle tanks, along with HJ-08s and 12s as well, among other similar systems. These weapons in particular were highly coveted by the Americans, as it would even the odds in a pinch against heavier Chinese or other armor. For the time being, even having basic RPGs was absolutely better than having nothing at all. The men hurriedly camouflaged their ATVs as they reached the woodline and cut the engines. They'd traveled at a snail's pace at some 5 miles an hour in order to maintain noise discipline as effectively as was possible, and arrived 1 hour upon leaving their position much deeper in the forest. They were in sight of a big box store and some fast food places, among suburban housing neighborhoods and even gas stations. Ideally, if somehow the gas station still had fuel or a way to pump any without power, it surely would have been a much simpler situation, but realistically, such was next to impossible. Even so, the men brought empty gas containers with them, as well as hoses for siphoning out of vehicles or any other fuel sources that could be found intact remaining. It was all so dark, eerily so. The big box store, fast food places, and gas stations, all sitting on the same road, appeared as mere shadows in the moonlight. It was so quiet that the breeze in the crisp fall early morning was all that could be heard as the men, bundled in coats covering their plate carriers or full body armor, wore hats to shield their ears from the nipping cold air. Finally completing the camouflaging, 5 of the men who'd been placed on temporary guard duty to protect the others doing the camo work on the recently parked all-terrain vehicles looked through the few NVGs they had, putting pairs of binoculars up to the lenses of their night vision optics. They sat quietly, observing. It was time to move out. Tony, Jacob, and the others listened to George, the leader of the expedition, whisper the plans, with the breeze concealing his whispers to where any enemies at a distance on some kind of a foot patrol, perhaps, wouldn't have been able to hear him at all, unless within maybe a 50-meter distance away or less. Fortunately, the men on watch duty hadn't reported yet any enemy actions, even through binoculars held up to their night vision gear. However, be that as it were, it didn't mean that enemies weren't out there, just that they weren't seen. So they weren't close to them, as a field sat between the wood line and suburban neighborhoods and housing developments, and the retail area on a suburban road off to the southeast, if gazing in the direction of Ann Arbor, from where the men now sat on the edge of the forest. George gave the hand sign to the men, and they got into 2 wedge formations, some basically 2 squads worth of men, albeit a little larger than a standard squad, of which there were 30 total men, each in 2 wedges of 15 apiece. It was understood that at first glance they might pass as a coalition patrol of sorts if spotted, but the subterfuge would only last a matter of seconds, as the random assortment of small arms would give them away if any air assets or ground assets really chose to hone in on them and scrutinize their equipment longer, as some of them did carry captured Chinese and North Korean weapons, and even some of their equipment as well. But if they remained in formations, something most Americans didn't do, minus the armed forces, which was largely now defeated, they might possibly get away with it for a moment, if very careful about it. Nobody talk. Try to use your coats to partially conceal your small arms by tucking them into your open coats a bit, to where perhaps the barrels barely protrude. We may be able to pull off the crossing of this field, but once we get in closer, all bets are off, stated George in a loud whisper as the men began moving out. It was well understood that it was possible for them to possibly pass for a roving patrol, but if enemies weren't being complacent and were really watching everything in the area, they could be called in on to see if there were any coalition troops in the area who were checking the wood line or not. in which case anything from enemy ground troops to armored vehicles to drone strikes or air or artillery strikes could be called in to deal with them. Despite that being indeed possible, the field wasn't a very long field, maybe barely over a kilometer or so. So the likelihood, at least of any of the aforementioned occurring, would be slim to none, provided they kept an adequate pace in the crossing of said field to better cover, that is. George led one wedge, and Tony led the other, as these two men had, generally speaking, the highest tactical knowledge and awareness. Of course, there were some other veterans among the group of men. However, these men were largely not combat veterans, despite having had the standard training and tactics, albeit very basic in many cases. The men proceeded through the tall grasses at a brisk but quiet pace overall. As they proceeded further, approaching the buildings seen earlier at a short distance from the wood line, they first approached not the housing developments, but the area holding the retail stores, the big box stores, gas stations, and fast food restaurants were more simple to observe for threats than would be the houses that sat in a moderately larger number, any of which could contain enemy forces well concealed within their frames. The men remained ready for any potential threats, although none seemed to present themselves for the time being. Nothing was seen in the darkened sky, nor were any indications of any enemy ground presence, at least within where they currently set their course for. Nothing whatsoever was said between the men, merely hand signs rendered for simple tactical communications as it pertained to any potential alterations or corrections of their current movements. They now began to approach an embankment, essentially a simple drainage ditch, albeit currently devoid of water within the simple grassy ravine, which skirted the edges of the shopping area. On the suburban road which ran between this retail area and the housing developments which branched off on the same road. It was a road which wound through the countryside, leading out of the main suburbs, ultimately turning into a city street upon reaching southeast into Ann Arbor proper. This outermost spur of the Ann Arbor suburbs, one could tell, was a relatively new area of outgrowth from the city's suburbs themselves. The homes were all newer, more freshly built suburban homes of perhaps simply 5 years old or newer. This based on their designs and the way the land appeared around them, where one could tell sections of forest had been cleared away, with fresh sod having been laid for grasses to grow, leaving residue of an undermud where one could tell that at one point this had all been relatively done recently. The men seen over the ravine while taking a knee that the nearest building was a gas station, which was connected to the parking lot of the big box store, whose signage and parking lot was totally devoid of light, as was the rest of the entire road and nearby neighborhoods. All, of course, a result of having had been hacked to where the grid had been totally shut down, as was the nation's satellites being swatted down from the anti-satellite weaponry of predominantly China, but also Russia as well. The silence was beyond deafening, as the artillery in this sector had fallen silent, largely due to the local forces in this zone, having had brought the majority of their invasion operations to a decisive close, appearing now to settle into a more occupation duty-based tempo of operations. Despite this largely being the case, the overall invasion across the whole land hadn't yet been brought to a complete end, although many areas had completely fallen entirely by the morning of day 3, of which it now officially was. Be that as it were, massive battles continued raging, where there still existed large pockets of resistance across the land, but one by one they were beginning to be extinguished, as if the light of various candles being put out one by one, little by little. The men who had night vision optics of whatever designs gazed here and there, even occasionally glancing at one another, seemingly confused, perplexed at the lack of noise, which just hours before had been completely deafening by all measure, as artillery and airstrikes and missiles of all varieties crashed all throughout the land. For such a seemingly drastic change to have occurred was beyond unsettling at best. George gave the move out hand sign, and the men got up to once again proceed, moving forward, coming atop the ravine. They began to carefully approach the outer gas station, and George whispered loudly, "Two guys, start scrounging for supplies. Check those vehicles for gas, too. If you find some, then start siphoning fuel." 2 of the men, acknowledging the order, took 4 of the now empty 5-gallon gas tanks they had brought along with the group, slung over the backs of 4 men carrying 1 each, and proceeded to scurry around the gas station, as the others were signaled into a large diamond formation to surround the gas station area. The men were fairly spaced out to do this, and some time went by, some perhaps 3 hours or so. Then George got with Tony, and quietly, nearly silently from the others, hashed out the next part of the plan. It was both miraculous and incredible, but also even nerve-wracking for all the men, that they had seemingly done all of this with relative ease, even for several hours. Tony was told to cover the gas station, as George led one of the 2 groups of 15 men carrying the gas cans back to the woods. This was done relatively fast, with George then returning once again back to the gas station where the others had waited, spread out even wider in a diamond to watch all of the approaches, as the other 15, led by George, had taken the fuel to the awaiting ATVs to load them up in the woods. So far, so good, as George managed to achieve this feat, as it was no small miracle up to that point that he had managed to do so. What George and the others weren't aware of is that on the eastern side of the AO, of the entire Ann Arbor and surrounding region, a massive operation was being conducted by large forces from the local units within the AO. there to block escape routes of Americans who were fleeing a failed guerrilla-style campaign that had been launched in the Detroit and surrounding regional area. Another different AO, occupied by massive PLA and other PAP forces, who requested that the forces in the Ann Arbor AO region and other surrounding AOs seal their AO border areas to prevent Americans from fleeing to other areas to be able to then set up shop. This request, while met by local forces occupying the whole Ann Arbor region, left relatively smaller forces in other portions of the overall AO for a short duration, allowing for the Americans still in this particular area to unknowingly have more slack to be able to conduct their own operations, despite not knowing the reason for the lack of a large response in western parts of the AO. Of course, there were still Chi-Com and North Korean forces still around in other parts of the Ann Arbor AO, but the numbers for now weren't close to what they had been just a little earlier, as the Chinese and their allies believed that they'd managed already to cleanse the Ann Arbor AO of virtually all meaningful resistance by the turn of day 3. And although for the most part this was actually true, they didn't know that the number of Americans remaining in hiding was actually sufficiently larger than previously assumed. This, or as well as the fact that they helped with the operations east of Ann Arbor, the Americans remaining in the western parts of the overall AO were taking the time to build up their insurgent capabilities. Of course, George and the others had no idea why they'd managed to be able to conduct this type of thing thus far with really no issues of any consequence, but that didn't mean they wouldn't have issues. The longer they took the risk to linger, sooner or later, despite the massive resources focused for the time being elsewhere, they'd be spotted and even noticed for who they were. Despite managing by this point to be virtually ignored by a high-altitude recon drone circling the whole 40 by 40 mile AO, as it was assumed that these were local patrol elements of perhaps North Korean allies, as those were predominantly the forces left in the western part of the AO, as the 2 Chi-Com PAP brigades went to the eastern part of the AO to seal it. Essentially, thus far, all of this was a blessing from God, all in all, as it couldn't have possibly been anything else. For all the above factors to align to produce such results, even an atheist wouldn't be able to call such a thing merely dumb luck. However, soon enough, there would be trouble looming, as one can only take so many chances with their God-given free will. Indeed, George would end up pressing matters too far, despite having such relatively good success by this point at achieving their erstwhile objectives of obtaining horribly needed fuel, and even sundry items such as whatever junk food and drinks, even over-the-counter meds or tobacco remained at this gas station, in the cashier's hut, or within the exterior refrigeration units, still cold, mostly due to the weather, despite there being, of course, no electricity. Jacob, who was by now stewing in his thoughts after what had happened to his family, whom he loved dearly, not knowing if they were alive and held against their will by the Chinese, or if somehow they'd been annihilated while trying to keep up with him in the forest skirmish the day before. George returned, and Tony broke formation within the diamond around the station and trotted over to speak to George as he left the returning wedge of men who themselves had returned from the woods just after putting things up there. After the two quietly exchanged words, Tony ran past the back of each man in his group of 15, being the 14 others still remaining in the diamond formation around the station, telling each one to form up again into a wedge, as the men being blocked by the station and largely unable to see Tony or George might have missed the hand signals whilst gazing out in their 360-degree security perimeter around the station. Tony finally got to Jacob and said, "Form up, wedge," in a whisper, as he jogged slowly past Jacob and took his position as the point man of the group's wedge formation. All the men fell in and formed up their two wedges, and George's wedge led the way through his hand signs given, with Tony merely imitating George due to George being the overall leader of the entire group of 30 total men. The hard part was already largely over with not only having filled via siphoning the fuel containers brought along through the abandoned vehicles at the gas station, which were used for the siphoning process, but also having taken their myriad of other scores as it pertained to the sundry items back as well, making it relatively easy and smooth overall, not having to perform the transfer to the wood line under any sort of enemy fire. In spite of this fortunate series of events, the intended recon in force wasn't over yet, and George, flush with success thus far, didn't know how to leave well enough alone. It would have indeed likely been for the best to simply quit the operation while they indeed had been miraculously successful thus far. But instead of coming back another time after having already been out for so long, kept pushing their luck, as the term put it. The force of two wedge formations now pressed forward and through the parking lot of the big box store, as the gas station and store were on the western side of the main road that bisected the retail area between the housing developments that lay both northwest and southeast on either side of the retail area off of the same road. Soon there came a noise. It was a vehicle engine. Then it sounded like several or more. One by one, headlights could now be seen. UAZ 469s with stovepipe-mounted machine guns were proceeding down the road, along with M1992s, which were armored cars with a KPVT 14.5 millimeter heavy machine gun in the turret and 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax machine gun alongside it as their main armaments. It was a North Korean recon unit on a patrol belonging to the Mechanized Infantry Brigade that had been largely left to hold down the rest of the AO, while most of the PAP forces were focused on the eastern line of it, unbeknownst to George and the others. Jacob yearned for revenge on the enemies for what had happened to his family, but he knew to follow commands and did not want to get not only himself, but those with him unnecessarily KIA'd. But he anticipated with bated breath that he would get his chance to exact such a toll. The forces moved through the area, because when the Chi-Com drone passed over again another time to check the particular area, either it had been largely ignored, but upon the information making its way to the North Korean allies, asking if they had any elements reporting in their findings from the group patrolling that area, the North Korean Brigade Command sent the request down the line asking who had troops patrolling that particular area at that particular moment. And when they got their answer back that nobody was patrolling, they ordered a close-by recon element to check the situation, to see if that was an element that had lost radio communications somehow and got lost, or what else could be going on there. In other words, this small group of KPA forces were now looking for George and his group. This would be where things would get interesting, as it were. The forces scouring the area had a platoon of UAZ 469s, totaling some 4 total scout vehicles, along with another 4 M1992s, which were the armored scout cars. This force was part of a recon company belonging to one of the battalions of mechanized infantry forces comprising the KPA Mech Infantry Brigade in the area. These men split into 2 smaller elements of 2 and 2 of each vehicle type. The UAZs were essentially Jeep-looking vehicles that had armored plating placed on the doors and around the engine block, largely being an ad hoc local upgrade, similar to the first American up-armored Humvees in their overseas conflicts. These vehicles had spotlights on them as well, and were being used to vigorously check the area for any sort of movement. This was bad news for the Americans using NVG optics, because light shined directly into these would be blinding and make movement or accurate firing of small arms nearly impossible due to the inability to aim correctly. So the men removed their optics should any firefight ensue. The North Korean troops, unlike their PAP and PLA counterparts, almost entirely lacked any sort of night fighting capabilities beyond maybe their special operations soldiers or other more specialized units, including many of their vehicles even as well. These troops didn't even possess even a few sets per squad, like even the Category C forces of China did, like their paramilitary national militia forces that were fighting in the mountains currently in the western USA. No, the North Koreans relied primarily on helmet lights or spotlights as it pertained to the vast majority of their forces. Although not always a bad thing, as enemies with night vision equipment could be blinded by such lights. But not always ideal either, as any moving lights presented the one holding it as a target, if the enemy could get the drop on them first during an encounter. Go! Return fire! Screamed George as he responded to one of the North Korean vehicle's stovepipe turret gunners on the back of the UAZ opening fire towards them, obviously in response to the spotlight actually spotting one of them, revealing an American instead of a North Korean soldier. Even despite staying low and generally trying to avoid being spotted from behind the myriad of parked abandoned vehicles littering the parking lot. Instantly, Jacob obliged and did just that, taking his first shots in combat. He hadn't fired any live ammo before up to that point, simply dry fire practice due to maintaining noise discipline requirements while training with the others. After all, noise was risky when in hiding, even in the forest. The recoil and sounds were all psychological for Jacob, as he expected a sort of kick from the recoil, but it never came. And his overcompensating for it mentally made his first shots wildly inaccurate, even on full automatic. Although the recoil itself wasn't particularly intense, there was an aspect of muzzle climb, which was a little bit different, meaning that on full auto fire, the rapidity of the fire made the muzzle slowly elevate higher to where it moved in a general upward motion, which at a distance meant that the rounds could fly too high over a target. He finally and very quickly learned to correct this upon doing a tactical magazine change upon emptying his first mag relatively quickly. Upon slapping in a new magazine, he got back to work and learned the feel of firing the Chinese-made QBZ-95 and switched it from full auto to semi-auto to thus be able to take more well-aimed individual shots, and occasionally rapidly pulling the trigger to be able to send smaller bursts of perhaps 4 to 5 rounds in rapid succession downrange at the enemy. One of the men with a .308 in an AR platform type of battle rifle, essentially what could be considered a battle rifle due to the caliber size being a full-on rifle caliber as opposed to an intermediate caliber, sent a round through the head of a North Korean machine gunner on the backs of one of the stovepipe-mounted general-purpose machine guns, leading to his head snapping back and slumping first onto the machine gun before then sliding off of it backwards and out of the back of the vehicle. The others dipped and dodged, with Tony running over in merely less than the 2-minute firefight up to that point, and pulling Jacob by the back of his shirt collar, reminding him to move, as he had sat in the same spot for barely over a minute and firing. This would lead to his being KIA'd, like a couple others had been, if he didn't move like the rest. The wedges were bounding and covering, but moving in a fighting retreat, as the North Korean vehicles and their level of firepower were an enormous threat, and even in the first few minutes had torn several men to total shreds. It was time to flee the area, because this patrol could realistically eliminate all of them with the machine guns available to them. Those who carried rocket-propelled grenades would be glad that they had, as they'd end up ensuring their ultimate survival against the small recon unit of KPA troops. They'd be used to great effect, but the key would largely be to evacuate the area before artillery and airstrikes could be called in on them. Whatever else in lieu of or in addition to such as well. They would realistically have very little time to make it back to their all-terrain vehicles, or they would risk being obliterated. After all, the firefight was onto its simply third minute by this point, and massive quantities of lead filled the air. "Get those RPGs on those armored scout cars, damn it!" yelled Tony this time, alluding to the M1992s, while the small arms would be best to deploy against the lighter Jeep-like UAZ 469s, as their occupants would be more exposed to such, as small arms virtually had no real effect on the other type of vehicle. As the seconds dragged on, Joseph got his first actual hits on the enemy. his blows landing on the windshield of one of the UAZs, tearing through it with multiple 5.8 by 42 millimeter rounds, hitting both the driver and TC in the two front seats, splattering the windshield with blood. Somewhat visible from the peripheral light of the passenger side searchlight of the UAZ. Soon thereafter, an anti-tank rocket-propelled grenade sailed through the air, fired by one of the few men wielding such weapons, before blasting upon it, crashing into and through the armor of one of the M1992s. By this point, some 4 of the 8 total vehicles were now out of commission, albeit at the cost of 14 Americans scattered throughout the 2 groups of 15 men apiece out of the 30 total men. The cost was heavy, and by 7 minutes in, the battle was still going. Of course, with the steady movement of both the North Korean and American elements maneuvering and having to readjust fire so frequently, many of the rounds flying smacked into many of the parked, abandoned vehicles in the parking lots, with a few tearing through, having had hit those hiding on the other sides of some of these vehicles. One man who was mortally wounded of the Americans recently hit was laying there bleeding out as one of the North Korean UAZ vehicles slowly proceeded closer and about to pass him in pursuit of the remaining Americans, allowing for him to roll a few of the Chinese-made hand grenades brought along for this recon mission beneath the vehicle, all the while fully knowing that he wouldn't survive his already sustained wounds at the hands of the North Koreans. The grenades blasted the vehicle's rear 2 wheels about a foot off the ground as both went off, leaving it as a smoking hulk of metal, with the gunner now halfway sprawling out of the back of the vehicle, dead from the shrapnel woundings, and the driver and TC in the front having had succumbed to the same, slumped forward onto the dash and steering wheel, respectively, of the now disabled and smoking UAZ 469. There were now 3 North Korean vehicles remaining in action, all being the more heavily protected M1992 armored scout cars. These continued shooting and rolling through the parking lot in pursuit, while soon thereafter the last UAZ 469 had been destroyed, hit by anti-tank rocket-propelled grenade round, having had hit its mark from the wedge that now made its way behind the better cover of the ravine bordering the rear of the gas station and parking lot of the big box store. 2 vehicles left now. It was now nearly 15 minutes into the skirmish, and soon would be very perilous to take chances remaining. Tony, badly wanting the spoils of the arms of the deceased North Korean troops in the destroyed UAZ vehicles, took a brave chance, running around the backs of many rows of parked vehicles from behind the ravine upon his remaining group having had reached the ravine, and ran even behind the erstwhile distracted last 2 M1992s that were now firing at the American groups that were hiding in the ravine. He ran to the closest destroyed UAZ and grabbed North Korean rifles, magazines, and threw them quickly in his pack, and slung the 3 rifles of the deceased over his shoulders, and even unpinned the general purpose machine gun from the stovepipe mount, a Type 73, which was a 7.62 by 54 millimeter general purpose machine gun, with the remains of the already locked and loaded bandolier of rounds that was still hanging out of it. The weight of the Type 58 rifles, which were basically North Korean AKM clones, and the Type 73 machine gun were all quite heavy, but upon reaching the ravine once more, ran and dropped them, yelling for others to hurry and pick them up to be able to carry them. He then, upon doing so, grabbed a few of the Molotovs, telling Jacob to grab a few more from some of the others who had brought the Molotovs along as well, which Jacob obeyed. Jacob followed Tony around the same vehicles Tony had gone around just a few minutes earlier, and got there by safely taking the ravine before safely emerging, hidden behind the lines of abandoned vehicles that obstructed them from view. The two men, mostly in an act of desperation to free up their escape route across the short field to be able to cross safely without being gunned down by the two remaining M1992s, ran behind them, lit, then tossed the Molotovs onto them, leading them to turn their turrets, only then for them to stop before having fully turned to meet the two men who tossed the flaming weapons onto their vehicles. Screaming now could be heard, and as hatches opened, revealing the burning men inside frantically trying to escape from both, were then gunned down with ease by Jacob and also by Tony. Soon thereafter, the two men bolted faster than they've ever ran before to the others, with Tony and George both yelling, even in near unison, "Run back!" with George alone adding, "Spread your asses out too! We've been thinned out!" Truly, there was no time to check for any wounded, and it was unlikely any remained, as those left alive by the end of this encounter were now merely numbering some 12 out of the original 30. Not even enough to leave with all of the ATVs, which had numbered 14 total. They thus had to leave two of their vehicles behind once reaching the wood line, with each of the remaining men being forced to each pilot one of them, Jacob included, as the men now left with some of the captured weapons, fuel, and sundry items obtained at the gas station, but at a very high cost. As soon as the men actually turned over the engines and fled, missiles flew in, along with artillery shells, hitting the field and the wood line merely several minutes upon the vehicles traveling out of the area, faster, a lot faster, than they took to arrive to conduct their operation, moving at some 30 miles an hour through the woods as the sun finally began to rise. The noise seemed to hearken back to merely hours before that they had actually come to do the operation, and no doubt the coalition was livid with these developments, having had made a series of wrong assumptions on the situation, which would undoubtedly lead to a series of harsh reprisals. This, even in spite of the fact that losses were relatively low in the grand scheme of things, but it was simply a matter of how the issue had been addressed by the local KPA forces of the North Korean Army, who for their part should have sent a larger force to investigate beyond merely just one single small recon platoon. The company captain over the recon company of which the platoon came out of was operating in sheer arrogance and overconfidence in order to prove a point that he and the whole larger KPA brigade he was part of had everything under control, to the extent that even a single platoon could manage any emerging threats in the assigned area of their particular company. Yes, heads would roll indeed. Despite losing just one platoon, it was still a bad look for the North Koreans, considering it was widely believed and relevant intelligence gathering indicated that for the most part, all meaningful resistance had been largely mopped up in the area. Having rapidly scarfed down the meager food provided in the PAP prison, June, Jacob's wife, was back on her concrete slab for a bed upon sliding the food bowl through the bottom food slot as the we to the GER trustees with accompanying PAP guard passed by to collect the empty food bowls. She was numb, feeling dead inside, knowing that her husband Jacob might be deceased, or if he was somehow alive, would never see her again. Nor would either of them see their son and two daughters, also now in PAP custody in the transit prison camp for the time being. The sounds of the camp, at least while awake, were extremely unnerving to June. Lots of sporadic, random yelling and dogs barking could be heard, albeit in a muffled tone from within her tiny concrete box, a modular portable prison cell. Also, muffled screams of agony could be heard as well, which sounded like the sounds one would make whilst being tortured. For June, she was now numb to it, because although this would have made most buckle with anxiety surrounding potential suffering, June was numb because mentally she was already in hell. What more could happen? As she thought this, some time went by, and of course, June had no idea how long, as there was no way to tell time in this facility. It didn't seem too long, though. If she had to guess, perhaps an hour, maybe two. The door soon opened, and two PAP troops walked into the puny cell, seemingly filling up the entire entryway to the cell, and grabbing June, pulled her out. Being extracted from her cell, she was told in broken English to stand still, as she was hooked up to leg shackles and had a chain belt with cuffs hooked up to her, and then hands locked into the cuffs in front of her stomach. They then escorted her to the cell block door connecting the short cell block hallway to the main hall of modular concrete building pieces. She then was walked down the hall, past numerous other doors to numerous other short cell block hallways, and to a hallway at the very end of the main hall, which intersected with the main hall before being led down the left, down the other hall, before reaching one of the rooms nearer to the end of this new hallway. She couldn't read Mandarin characters, but it said in Mandarin, "Interrogation room number 4." She was led into it and had her leg shackles cuffed to a cuff which was part of the floor in front of a steel bench, also cemented into the floor as well, of the portable interrogation room. The guards turned and walked out of the room, leaving her inside. She sat in the room, looking at all of the Chinese propaganda posters and pictures of Xi Jinping everywhere, on every wall in the room, nearly plastering it like wallpapering. Perhaps several minutes elapsed, and the door burst open, as it was a steel door on hinges and not an automatic door opened by keycards like the cell blocks were. There entered a man in an olive green military formal dress uniform and sat his cap upon the table, as well as an ashtray and a pack of Chinese cigarettes. He sat on the steel table in a near lean, all while staring at June, even managing to crack a seemingly kind smile. Every agent of the MSS, the premier Chi-Com intelligence agency, secret police, and liaison with the armed forces intelligence services, all rolled into one, had their own means of interrogation and intelligence gathering when it came to how they dealt with prisoners. Some preferred to abuse, torture, and break down their charges, while others took a drastically softer approach, and some used a combo of both. Agent Liu Zhong was the latter, preferring to adjust his tactics based upon whomever he was dealing with, and based also upon how cooperative they were with him. He sized up June as he looked at her and at his tablet, which the artificial intelligence program had already established her file based upon stolen American civilian and military records through the hacking over the years, coupled with whatever data had been collected on her in particular, since brought into Chinese PAP custody at the transit camp prison. He finally spoke in flawless English, in a soft tone, as much of one as he could muster, that is. "My name is Liu Zhong. Welcome to our facility. Do you smoke?" he asked, omitting his title and offering her a cigarette. June, although not a current smoker and not having smoked since she was younger, had been under so much stress from the war and also from her ordeal in captivity thus far, to where she graciously accepted. Agent Liu lit her cigarette for her before lighting his own. He then proceeded to make some small talk in order to try to soften her up, before finally sitting down on the bench across the table from June. As he smoked, he consulted his tablet several times and looked up at June while smiling at her before clicking on several items. "Do you like the cigarette? It's organic tobacco, no additives. There's more where that came from. All I ask is that you answer my questions, and I'll see about getting you some better accommodations, and perhaps even allowing you to write a letter to your son and 2 daughters," Liu said to June. "Are my 3 children all right? Please tell me they're all right." June's voice cracked as her eyes instantly teared up upon hearing this. "Yes, they're unharmed and adjusting to the new circumstances. They're in a section for the youth," answered Liu, to which point June sighed a sigh of some relief, but mixed with the pain of being reminded that her family was all separated. "Tell me, do you remember anything about your husband? What did he do before the war?" asked Liu in a friendly, inquisitive response, as he took a deep draw on his cigarette before exhaling a large plume of smoke out of the side of his mouth away from June, who was across the table from him. "Well, he was a manager of a hardware store, and I was a stay-at-home parent. He really climbed the ladder at his job, which helped us afford a good life, all in all," June responded, to which Liu pretended to be interested and asked a few more questions about her home life and about details of her family, by which point June began to crack a smile as she reminisced about better times prior to the invasion. Bit by bit, her guard was being lowered. However, Liu was using his tablet to record the interrogation interview and began to ask more serious questions once the softball questions were then out of the way. Listen to me. I want to help you, but the more you open up to me, the more I can help you. I need you to tell me, what was the situation like for you and your family when the invasion began? Please recount everything you went through and you can remember. And tell me how you managed to survive and make it out of Ann Arbor. Truly remarkable for a family of 5 of average means, Liu said, while sounding genuinely intrigued. June didn't know or understand anything about interrogation techniques or the purpose of such questions. But the question she was actually being asked was meant to be able to ascertain how rat lines and underground networks functioned and operated amongst the Americans, by which the intelligence collected could paint a more comprehensive picture of the area and how average people were even able to evade capture, such as people like the Robinson family, who had no known military background or formal training, the purpose of which would be to plan interdiction missions by properly estimating how these things functioned and what sorts of places constituted key nodes along specific escape and evasion routes. Liu sat there and listened to the details recounted by June before stopping her momentarily and sending a direct message to the desk sergeant of the PAP to have him bring June stationery and pencils, as well as tobacco in the form of cigarettes and simple waterproof matches of the cheap MRE variety. Even a blanket and pillow, being the basic disposable types often given for free, similar to that the airlines offer. The hospitality, albeit very basic, would serve as a means to keep her talking. The door opened quietly, as opposed to the usual hard bursting sound of the metal slapping against concrete, with a PAP guard bringing in the items and placing them on the table. June began viewing this MSS agent as being someone with a kind heart, compared to what she had endured at the hands of the PAP up until this point of her current meeting with Liu Zhang. She was surprised by the items, and she actually thanked him and even asked for one more thing: a little more food. Liu, pleased with her level of cooperation thus far, put the order in on his tablet for double rations, as she had been a cooperative subject in the interrogation, relaying this to the PAP commandant's staff running the part of the facility in which she was currently locked up. She continued to recount her experiences up until the point of capture. She then was smiled at by Liu and thanked for her cooperation, and was told that she would be moved to the main camp as the AI systems would be determining her final disposition. She was scared of what that meant, but Liu responded by saying, "It was wise of you to be so cooperative. So I'm going to show you something. Once you write your son and daughters a letter," to which June, who was given the paper and pencils, wrote a lengthy letter. And upon finishing, Liu took it while informing June that he would deliver it personally. He actually would do so, but not before he photographed it to examine the letter for any potential intelligence value, before then handing it off to her children. Surely, it was a small concession to allow this communication to take place. After all, this family, the Robinsons, would never actually see one another ever again. So this was basically June's last real opportunity to say anything. Many were never given such a chance. When the doors slammed home and it sunk in for those in PAP custody, just how horribly they'd be treated. Upon her leg shackles being uncuffed from the floor cuff, the two PAP guards returned to the room to escort June along with Agent Liu down the hallway in which she had come to the interrogation room. Instead of turning to return to her cell block, she was walked past where the two halls intersected, the main hall and the current hall she was in, to a room on the right-hand side further down this hallway. One of the PAP guards unlocked the doorway and opened it to reveal two men chained to a wall, whereby they had a pipe slid behind their backs to where it went between them and their back, which was held in place by their elbows due to their hands being cuffed in front of them. The pipe itself was cuffed in between both elbows to the wall, and the knees of the men were bent into pea gravel, with their ankles also chained to the pipe by their leg shackles, to where their knees could not escape the pea gravel. The men looked horrible, and obviously had passed out from the agony of being in such a position for such a long time, screaming and hollering in sheer suffering, and the massive pain causing them to break down, both mentally and physically, and finally leading to them passing out. "The yelling you'll sometimes hear is coming from these types of rooms. This is where the uncooperative find themselves. More often than not, it was wise of you to have been obedient. These men here have been put here for 2 days to think about their choices," said Liu, changing from a kind-sounding tone to a cold and empty-sounding tone, showing the other side of him. "Of course, you won't be treated in such a way, provided you continue to obey the rules here. And instead of the bordello, you'd be put into general population with drastically better accommodations, instead of being treated like our whore." June, by this point, was totally speechless and stood in horror, gazing at the two men before the door was shut by one of the PAP guards, before then taking June back to her cell with the other guard, one grabbing each of her arms. All as Agent Liu walked off down the other side of the hall, as if on to the next task, as it were, seemingly forgetting all about June as he had other business to attend to. When June returned to her cell, she sat contemplating everything. As the door opened with a PAP guard escorting a trustee to the GER, tossing in her cigarettes, matches, the cheap blanket and cheap pillow, and even handing her a meal of noodles and rice balls with some kind of fish in them, or along with steamed carrot slices and snow peas. While Liu actually honored his promises, she was mortified by all that she had seen, right as she was beginning to think that maybe the Ch1nese weren't so bad after all. She was wrong, but they kept their word in her case, and in the case of others who made their work easier. June was obviously conflicted and psychologically had been played, even though she lacked the abilities or knowledge to realize how she'd been played. After seeing the tortured men in the room, she now began to understand that merely speaking to the Ch1nese to where they were satisfied obviously meant she massively messed up. Even lacking the awareness to know exactly how and in what ways, Liu would use the intelligence gathered not only from June, but other MSS agents would be doing the same with their fruits acquired through their interrogations of other Americans to be able to paint a bigger picture of the happenings throughout and within their overall area of operations, or AO, in the Ann Arbor region, to thus be able to interdict and put a stop to any viable resistance elements rising up against their occupation. Fairly soon, June would be transferred to the general population of the transit camp upon leaving the intake cell houses, whereby she would remain until she was sorted by her level of cooperation and classification as assigned to her by the PAP's AI, EPW sorting program, which would then determine her final destination as a prisoner. Part 21. Roaming through the ripped-up woods early on day 3, Joseph, his wife Sally, and all the rest of the fighting men and their families kept up a brisk pace to elude the soon-to-be-arriving search parties of Chinese paramilitary troops of the 4th National Militia Corps, who maintained 3 total battalions in the area, numbering nearly 3,000 total troops that were close by in Butte, the current headquarters of the entire 4th Corps, whose headquarters battalion and 2 of its subordinate truck infantry battalions had recently been attacked in a relatively small hit-and-run style recon and force assault by the total 105-man strike force that was put together by Joseph out of his total 250 fighting men, which had moved in to prod the perimeter guard forces of Butte while conducting their mission just mere hours before being hit by retaliatory heavy artillery barrages into the forest, as well as some airstrikes being carried out in tandem with that by a squadron of JH-7 ground attack aircraft, causing the forest to be shred to pieces, with areas of it aflame even from some of the napalm as well as white phosphorus illumination shells and napalm tanks from the aircraft, respectively. There were the illumination shells had been set to PD fusing or point detonation fusing so that it would burn any organic vegetation upon the shells bursting as they hit the ground, as these shells were normally used for air bursts. It was a scene seemingly itself to be apocalyptic, to put it modestly, because it seemed in other ways far, far worse, almost like hell in some ways. They'd by now been moving for several hours to where they'd by this point fled far to the southeast in the direction of Bozeman and its northern outlying areas. Areas where it was known to house the other Americans recently discovered the day before by the scouting element sent out by Joseph to look for other American survivors in the local area and region to join up with. There were some nearly 300 within this other group, of which Joseph and his people had set out to find. Combined with these 300 other men, with the now less than 250 since the raid hours before, would be able to possibly amalgamate together into a larger force, one that might stand a bit more of a chance at survival. Though unaware, some remaining 110 survivors from the 1st of the 163rd, once a cavalry squadron of the Montana Army National Guard, which being a battalion-sized element, but due to being cavalry, was called a squadron in quotes, was also headed west from slipping out of encirclement at the end of day 1 and into day 2, having had fled to seek shelter in the mountains, seeing it as their only possible chance to level the playing field at least a little bit with the invaders. They'd already made their way to make contact with 300 American fighting men who operated outside of Bozeman to its direct north of the city. Soon, Joseph and his group would be linking up as well, and the force would end up being a bit bigger in number, but better equipped slightly than was originally anticipated. This, as the arms taken by Joseph's group, including those recently captured in the raid, along with those of the 300 other men, and even the lighter weaponry that the tiny group of surviving guardsmen brought with them as well, as all of which would make an overall contribution to being able to carry out drastically more effective future operations, at least in the shorter term, as the flow of weapons and associated ammo types would be necessary to maintain at a steady level in order for their forces to even remain somewhat viable on the current battlefield. As to run out without replenishment would signify certain doom for such a force. It wasn't long before the posted guards spotted Joseph and his group and made a clicking noise, to which Joseph returned the same as he led the way. It was a quadruple tapping on the barrel of his Springfield rifle with his Glock's magazine bottom in a sort of tap, 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 tap. This was a pre-agreed upon signal as brought back by his scouting element, one of his miniaturized 50-man understrength companies he'd sent to seek other Americans out. The guards emerged from laying down in the prone position, hiding in the foliage and undergrowth, to meet Joseph and his enormous group behind him, who no doubt could tell they were friendlies, but had to maintain protocols just to be sure anyway. "This way," said one of the posted guards in a relatively quiet voice before leading the group to their main campsite. There were a series of trenches and foxholes, not that dissimilar to those which Joseph and his group had earlier constructed within their area that lay east of Butte to the north of where they currently now found themselves. The camp in which they now found themselves currently wasn't quite as well dug in as theirs had been, of which they had just departed from, but it was still adequate enough for what it was, and well camouflaged, despite lacking the total larger bunker chambers which Joseph's group had taken refuge within to survive the air and artillery strikes earlier. These were more of a simple trench system, which were covered by chopped down tree parts and branches with thin dirt roofing above the trenches, which were covered by foliage and pine branches in order to disguise them from aerial assets that the enemy possessed. The foxholes were all single-person sized foxholes. Some were covered and lived in, some were more or less merely temporary guard structures for posting men to protect the camp in key nodes of the perimeter, or even within the camp proper itself, in some of the higher topographical points. Joseph and his 5 sub-commanders of his 5 miniaturized companies approached the trench, which was the leadership's living space and ad hoc command center, led by the guards on the perimeter, leading them to meet with their leaders upon finding other guards to quickly temporarily take their place at their guard posts on the perimeter so as not to abandon their sectors completely. Meeting Joseph and his sub-commanders of his force was the leader of the 300-man forces of the current Bozeman area, as well as a guardsman, a major, who was the ranking man among the tiny group of surviving American Guard forces from the 1st of the 163rd, essentially being overly ranking for the tiny group of forces who had managed to flee, which was more or less the size of an average American company-sized element, albeit one comprised of survivors from the fighting further east in Montana, and not an actual entire company unit being comprised of survivors from different various companies within that squadron. The major was the adjutant of the lieutenant colonel, who was the commanding officer of the whole 1st Cav Squadron of the 163rd Cav Regiment. The lieutenant colonel had already been KIA'd or perhaps taken POW by the Ch1nese, as this wasn't fully determined. The men all introduced themselves and sat down for an introductory meeting between all of them, as well as discussing their goals, their ideas, and setting objectives for themselves and their combined forces when deciding to stick and work together for the long term, as it was simply a bad idea to remain divided, and thus being far simpler to divide and conquer, as the saying went. Joseph, upon discussing logistical requirements for survival and future operations, voiced his desires to set up a smaller, more elitist sort of covert operations force, to which he was instantly met by skepticism, as there were no sorts of men which could comprise the backbone of such a specialty American force. Beyond the basic former war veterans and also the actual guardsmen who were now present in recent current service who had managed to flee for their lives from the battle at Billings, Joseph wouldn't give up the idea, as he continued to plead his case as to why such a force needed to be assembled and what it could achieve were it to be done right, eventually leading the National Guard major to concede to the fact that it would possibly make a great impact on intelligence gathering, as well as strike major sabotage types of blows, but that they'd need to find the actual men who could train such a force. Shortly thereafter, the head of the 300-man Bozeman area American forces then stated that that a couple of his men were ex-special operations forces, but were very old and not in proper shape for long-range recon patrolling or infiltrating enemy-held areas and whatever else would be ideal for setting or for getting one up on the enemy. However, that wasn't to say that they couldn't possibly give it their best or even come up with a training regimen of sorts, but that would take time and dedication, as such training and proficiencies realistically would take ample amounts of time. Realistically, this could take weeks or perhaps even months. Joseph, satisfied for the time being that his idea still had the potential to get underway, finally piped down about it and asked to meet the men discussed in relation to his idea as soon as possible. Troy, the leader of the 300-man forces north of Bozeman, who replaced the previous leader who had been KIA'd on day 2 from a drone strike during an attempted ambush while leading it, wasn't being antagonistic. He simply wanted to use the limited remaining resources to the very best of their ability. This, as they already burnt through quite a bit of ammo and other resources in order to try to ambush the local PAP forces in the Bozeman sector to try to obtain more, but were beaten back even worse than was Joseph's forces beaten back earlier in the north upon the completion of their raid. Upon learning this, Joseph suggested that this newly amalgamated American force head north with him back to his old area to fight the National Militia paramilitary forces instead of fighting the PAP, who was vastly heavier and better equipped when compared to all the other types of Chi-Com paramilitary troops. As this was the CCP's Praetorian Guard-like combat forces, similar to other similar contemporaries of other nations, or those in times past, such as the SS in World War II era Germany. Joseph explained that if they waited until about after sunrise, the forces that had been no doubt looking for them up north after their earlier barrage after the earlier barrage carried out, being called in by the 4th National Militia Corps, would likely have returned back to Butte, which would allow for this now larger force of Americans to be able to carry out another assault. This would be able to keep up some momentum and pressure on the local Chi-Coms in Butte instead of Bozeman, and would also have to suffice, since Joseph's idea of creating a small, specialized elite type of force wouldn't be feasible for some time, as it were anyhow. The men, all debating the merits of the different proposals and ideas, came to their conclusions in the various areas ranging from logistics to accommodations for their non-combatants and families to also even future operations. The battle continued to rage throughout the state line mountain range as Bill had ran up and out of the ravine-like formation of ground and up to the mountainside upon hearing of the men in the ditch with him yell that a hand grenade had landed very loudly before it detonated, cutting down several men in one swift stroke of its pulse of detonation. He barely made it out, with others, fortunately for him, bearing the brunt of the blasting munition, having had been in the way of it, largely absorbing the shrapnel and concussion as it went off. He ran, dipping and dodging, as rounds smacked the hillside, raking up and down it, as the sounds of combat now raged all around and continued. Although it was informally led and poorly coordinated in terms of the greater defenses of the entire area, the interlocking fields of fire of men and some women, even taking cover in various positions, managed to make the going very tough for the Chi-Com National Militia infantry troops charging up the mountain in hot pursuit after them. Although this was totally attributed to the bravery and initiative taken by the Harty mountain people and not to any formal planning, it was still not enough to stop the enemy, as the attrition rate remained heavily lopsided, besides the fact that in this particular instance, the enemy was being fought on a more even footing and keel, mostly due to it being largely an infantry-on-infantry battle as the elevation got higher and higher, and the Chi-Coms couldn't bring their vehicles much higher as the mountain climbed upwards. Unless, of course, they stuck to the very few limited roads in the mountains. Of course, artillery and air power was immensely in favor of the Chinese, but man to man, the terrain aided the defenders in evening the odds a little bit more than they'd otherwise have been on worse terrain for them. Move, 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 move! Yelled men as others began bit by bit to abandon their previous positions as enemy forces started en masse to begin crossing the road just down the slope from where the Americans began now abandoning various natural formations in the side of the mountain, leaving to move higher and higher, even towards the mountain peaks themselves. The defenders were being cut down where they stood, as they stood and ran upwards towards the mountaintop, being hit by various ammunition types, from rifle and light machine gun to general-purpose machine gun and even heavy machine gun rounds in some cases, as the Chinese forces brought their tripods and W-85 12.7mm machine guns forward where possible. The Chinese also continued firing anti-personnel RPG ammunition and anti-tank missiles such as the HJ-08s, either tripod or shoulder-mounted. Occasionally, airstrikes continued to be called in upon sites whereby the advancing Chi-Com forces met more stiff resistance, leading to massive blasts and sometimes even eruptions of flame from occasional 2,000-pound napalm tanks being dropped on the mountainsides, which lit the dark sky with sheer ferocity of the tornado of flame being caused in the forested mountains. Bill zigzagged up the mountainside, with others hastily fleeing amid the splashing rounds, flying in and smacking into dirt and rocks, sending up a storm of debris, some of which was dangerous to the point where it injured people when it struck their eyes or other sensitive, unprotected parts of their bodies, enough to where it made people uneasy about running, even with the utter need to do so to avoid being wiped out. There were simply no options but to keep moving. The enemies crossing the road below began to now reach the freshly abandoned previous American positions just left mere minutes before. As Bill nearly reached the virtual peak of the particular mountain upon which he currently found himself, the topographical positions here were excellent. However, the enemy was highly determined and would be seeking the very top in order to plant their flag for propaganda purposes, but also to chase the Americans down into the high mountain valley on the other side and up the next range of the local mountains. After all, a large area was now encircled on all sides between one Russian battalion, 2 PAP battalions, and 10 Chi-Com National Militia battalions, seeking the destruction of the freshly created pocket, of which the only escape was death or surrender. Unless, of course, a determined breakthrough attempt could be formulated, but the forces encircled lacked any form of communications, organization, and coordination in order to even be able to conduct such an operation. This, as their now dwindling supplies and lack of centralized leadership, made such an act virtually impossible by this point, as they were having a difficult enough time of staying viable in their defense of the locality. Bill, among others, fired down from their lofty positions at the Chinese aggressor forces, who continued firing upwards at them, truly an uphill battle in the literal and figurative sense, but one in which the defenders were having a horrible go at it, despite the terrain having had somewhat evened out the odds, at least a little bit, leveling the playing field somewhat better than would normally be the case. Regardless of this being the case, the enemy was losing troops to accomplish this feat, numbering now their losses in the dozens. The fact that they were attacking with nearly 13,000 total troops involved between all the different Chi-Com paramilitary forces involved and one Russian allied battalion on the Idaho side made the losses seem somewhat minuscule, relatively speaking. However, for the particular Chi-Com units involved, the losses were a big deal to them personally, as comrades watched each other be wounded or KIA'd in many cases, leading to a determination to finish the operation as rapidly as was feasible. The forces involved kept pressing forward. Bill and the other Americans, though having fallen back and up the mountain in disarray, began to regain their relative footing and began to slug back against the attackers who were now in hot pursuit of them. Several overbearing attacking platoons of Chi-Coms did take heavy losses while leading a probing action against the current American positions by and near, as well as on top of the mountain itself, causing them to have to break off the assault for the short time being, although many other enemy forces below continued to fire up at the now re-established American positions, calling in precision artillery and airstrikes on the positions, as well as using their own mortar companies in tow with them for additional on-the-spot fire support. This signified the obvious, that they were about to mount yet another assault. As artillery and airstrikes came in, many Americans were partially or fully shielded by the rough terrain and topographical features, and even some small caves and rock formations and clefts near the top of the mountain served as ad hoc shelters from all the landing munitions. With the fighting taking on some aspects of a combo of Vietnam and Afghan style fighting all rolled into one. The heavy pounding delivered by a squadron of Russian Su-34s was so intense it tossed boulders to and fro, as did the Chi-Com and Russian artillery strikes delivered as well. The mortars, though not as powerful as the aforementioned, did their own massive damage as they rained death from above by falling downwards literally on the heads of the Americans who were unshielded in certain spots. Many lives were wiped out then and there in a matter of merely 1 hour. Bill and the others knew that another determined assault would be pressed, as men yelled that the Chinese were moving again, coming uphill towards them. Essentially, this was the signal to those taking cover, in whatever positions they'd managed to safely wait out the heavy air and artillery combo, to emerge to fight the new Chi-Com attack, now moving up the slopes against them. The invading forces had held their positions merely 500 meters below the nearest Americans for the duration of the danger-close air and artillery strikes they'd called in, including their own light artillery fired in the form of the mortars as well. Now that it had concluded, they were back at it again on the offensive. Although somewhat more thinned out, the Americans now fought like hell to prevent the Chi-Coms from having an easy victory, at least in this particular sector of the whole pocket, which as a whole was slowly being squeezed, which was forcing the defenders into a sort of more back-to-back type of situation. The smaller the perimeter of it began to shrink. Instantaneously, flew up the anti-personnel RPG rockets and anti-tank missiles from below, as well as barrel-mounted grenades from below, some of the enemy rifles that were carried by certain troops wielding such, fired upwards in a deadly arc and landing upon some of the Americans, causing many to realize that they needed to spread out more to avoid heavy casualties from such weapons, such as the grenades, rockets, and missiles now being fired upon them. Although the artillery and air, as well as mortar strikes, had already taught many that lesson already, Bill now was in the cleft of a rock formation close to the peak, and a cave was off a bit to his left-hand side, whereby he had taken cover during the earlier heavy ordnances which had laid waste to many atop the mountain. He used this particular spot to his best advantage, firing downward at the advancing enemies moving up the slopes. He popped up or off to the side of the large rock he hid behind to create a variation in his movements to attempt to confuse enemies who couldn't see too well in the dark environment that they were currently now fighting in, minus those who had NVG sets. It would, however, be daylight in merely a few more hours, but for now, Bill was getting away with it to a certain extent, though. Though return fired upon, his position for the moment offered him protection from all sorts of weapons, even RPGs and anti-tank missiles, mostly due to the shape of the topography and rocks themselves, as he was wedged into a narrow spot between the rocks, which enabled the blasts of the ordnance-based weaponry to harmlessly blast mostly around his current position, but not down into his position due to the narrow spacing of the rocks. This, as the huge rocks absorbed all the shrapnel and all the concussive blast waves from the rockets and missiles, as they weren't quite strong enough to eliminate these specific rock formations in which now Bill took cover. Bill was nearly covered from above as well from the same rock formation, although not completely entirely in some places, but the stone almost curved overhead to form a sort of bunker-like effect with the rock cleft. He hit multiple Chi-Com paramilitary troops as they charged uphill, bounding and covering as they leapfrogged their way uphill behind cover and concealment positions. Unfortunately for enemy forces, fighting uphill afforded them very few effective cover and concealment positions, though. Of course, that wasn't to say that there weren't any, but there weren't enough or effective to the point that they were afforded the same protection as the Americans that were uphill from them actually were. Of the enemies hit by Bill, it was possible that a few were KIAs, but it was highly likely, rather, that most were WIAs, including those simply catching the rounds in their armor plates to where they weren't severely injured, just minorly so. Despite this, it kept the enemies from charging in long charges, relegating their advance to shorter bounds to avoid taking as many hits as possible. There were multiple companies charging uphill in just this one sector, as battalions and their subordinate companies that comprised said battalions were on the move all throughout this pocket, pressing forward as quickly as they could. This race to the proverbial finish line was a deadly affair indeed for both defender but also attacker in many cases. The defense stiffened in spite of the current assault, as the Americans remaining were seemingly getting the hang of the ebb and flow of combat. Hardy American mountain people were among the toughest resistors of the foreign invasion forces, as even the American military didn't throw up the level of resistance in most areas that many of these armed civilians did. Of these, they'd been given a firm proverbial backbone by American veterans of the so-called old military. These men, who actually had real experience and or training, began to take initiative in many areas whereby others had not and could not, because most Americans knew nothing of war or battle tactics or even overall grand strategy. And because there was no working communications, there thus was little to no organization and coordination, meaning that those who stepped up and took charge would be they who worked to rectify these issues to the best of their God-given abilities. Bill Glass, though not a soldier, was learning the ropes, and it had been truly a miracle that he had even managed to make it even this far. Even as he was pinned down in his current position, and for the time being, unable to safely leave it. He did what he had to do, and all that he realistically could do. continue shooting. Other Americans running from position to position, some even trying to collect the wounded, like had happened earlier to Brian, who had been fighting alongside of Bill, were also fighting as hard as they could. Very few of them had managed to acquire some enemy weapons, albeit in very small quantities when they did. But the wise ones with these budgeted them as the situation required, meaning those who had hand grenades or small arms or even the even more rare RPG that was acquired had to be careful how they deployed these items as the tactical situation developed or changed. One who had a few hand grenades tossed them over a berm on the mountainside, topped with some trees. They rolled down the slope upon landing, blasting and sending up smoke and debris surges. They managed to KIA several Chi-Com troops. This development caused the Chinese forces in the area to pause in order to scan for specific enemy positions that could have been responsible for that savage grenade attack in order to lay suppressive fire on that particular area in case there were potentially more of them coming from those same attackers or that area. Bill just kept on firing his AR and laying down fire until he finally was low on ammo. Now down to nearly 1.5 magazines, including the one halfway empty that was in his rifle. He began yelling for more ammo. He hoped someone, anyone, would hear his calls for help. Someone did, and dropped into the cleft of the rocky position with him as he ran and dodged enemy fire. "Here, brother, I got you," he said to Bill, as he himself also had an AR on him as well, and dropped 2 more mags on the ground for Bill. The man had obviously no time to make introductions in the middle of combat, but instead ended up staying in the position with Bill and firing out from it every so often in a sort of rotation with Bill. The fight was more and more intense as Chinese forces moved ever closer, albeit at having a slower pace than before due to the caution they took, with shorter bounds and coverings. They were no further now than 150 meters away from the nearest American positions, perilously close indeed. They could almost see their faces in the light of all the muzzle flashes from all the thousands of small arms and burning distant trees aflame from napalm strikes earlier. The flashes revealed men hit by flying rounds, some in the face, as the rapid muzzle lightings could illuminate the blood flying out of those hit in such areas, as a horrific sight indeed in all its ferocity. In the midst of the savage combat, there was little to no thought of reflection, as everyone now had to live in the moment. There was no time to think, only time to react as the situation moved. Only later, when it was all over, could those who even survived this experience be able to look back upon it from their memory banks. The man with Bill in his position with him pulled out a Chi-Com made hand grenade, taken earlier from one of the deceased. The man pulled the pin and aimlessly threw it out from the side of the rocky position to where his body wouldn't quite be exposed, only his arm to let it go out of his hand. Soon there was a blast and yelling. Suddenly there came a response as several anti-personnel RPG rockets impacted around the rock formation, whereby the rocks managed to shield Bill and the other man from instant death as the concussive blasts threw around debris from pieces of rock blown off of the natural formation as the munitions detonated. Truly, this was a perfect spot in terms of the protection afforded by it, But sadly, the men would need to soon abandon it and head higher as the enemy advanced ever closer. They now were just over 100 meters away from them, and it was now dangerous to stay much longer. The men popped out to fire and scored several more hits on enemies, but Bill knew what time it was. "We gotta get the hell out of here! We gotta stay with the others!" yelled Bill at the top of his lungs as loud as he could over the intensity of the cacophony surrounding the entire area, as the looming small arms fire came ever closer and closer. The other man could do nothing but nod in agreement and suggest a way out. They'd had to move fast and seamlessly slip up a bit higher to the mountain peak before figuring out their next moves. The other Americans in the area just below the peak were starting to withdraw atop the mountain itself, in the hopes of throwing up a final defense up there on the mountaintop, before then retreating into the mountain valley below. There was a purpose for this fighting retreat, but even though they didn't realize they were yet in a pocket due to having no communications, were of the belief that they could indefinitely fight in retreat to bleed the enemy and make each and every mountain a bloody prize to capture. In some respects, this was actually a logical view and move, but in others, they were completely and totally unaware that they were being squeezed on all sides by enemies with no viable means of escape. Soon they'd be back to back with other local defenders, as some of the battalions of the 4th Corps of the paramilitary Chi-Com National Militia Forces already involved in this battle would be splitting this large pocket into two smaller pockets by lunging forward in the middle of this large pocket where they'd found local roads upon which they could use their vehicles to be able to take full advantage of their firepower and to bisect this large group of originally over 1,000 defenders and split them into two smaller groups. Currently, the defenders were thinned out substantially from their original numbers, of course. However, they proved to be a more formidable opponent than even expected by the Chinese and Russian forces involved along the entire state line area, because that went for other clusters of similar American forces, now having been destroyed in pockets or barely having had escaped them to fight on another day. Many had escaped to the southeast and attempt to bottle them up into a massive pocket, as there were some 3,000 Americans just 10 miles to the southeast of the pocket in which Bill was trapped, engaged in a huge battle with the PAP and other forces also from the 4th Corps of the paramilitary Chi-Com National Militia Forces. The fighting there had been even more intense than was the fighting in the pocket in which Bill now found himself trapped with the others in his particular area, unbeknownst to them. Besides Bill, the other man lunged out of the position, firing the whole way as he ran. Bill followed behind him 5 seconds later, only he didn't open fire because he was scared to reveal his exact position via muzzle flash. It wasn't until he finally reached the top that there was rough terrain everywhere to hide amid. Americans nearer to the edge of the mountain, adjacent to the Chi-Com approaches, continually opened fire downhill, as Bill and the others reaching the top yelled that they were friendlies to avoid being hit by any potential friendly fire. Unfortunately, there were such incidents, although it was very few. There were wounded taken care of on the mountaintop as well, with unarmed civilians, some formerly in the medical field in the local area, and its communities, managing to care for them and to dress the wounds. The ambulatory wounded, those who could walk, were being ushered off quietly down the other side of the mountain, away from the Ch1nese, while those who required transport were carried off by those who volunteered to be able to carry them off on makeshift gurneys or pallets consisting of wood or cloth, slings, or whatever else could be used and salvaged, some of it coming from several now blasted mountain cabins and homes that were en route up the mountain earlier. Even one cabin at the very top appearing to be a survivalist's cabin, quite primitive, which had been totally annihilated by air and artillery crashing into the mountaintop from the earlier preparatory bombardment and airstrikes. Anything that could be put to use was put to use with good old-fashioned American ingenuity. The wounded were hurriedly being removed en masse, with others reaching the top, yelling about the Ch1nese moving ever nearer to the top of the mountain. The others fought on with a zeal not yet even seen, as they intended to make the mountaintop a very costly endeavor for the Ch1nese indeed. The Ch1nese jumped into positions now freshly abandoned by the Americans and prepared to conduct their final checkmate moves when it came to seizing the mountain peak itself, merely 50 meters from where their positions now currently sat. Those on the edges of the peak itself fired down at the enemy from somewhat relatively safe positions made from nature itself. The peak was rocky and rough and jagged, filled with massive rocks, ditches, berm-like areas, and even a few trees here and there. But the topography here was superb for a dogged defense. The Americans that survived to this point and still could still fight took positions in many of these areas and prepared for the inevitable. This as the Ch1nese prepared to do their final charge to take the mountain peak. However, they'd have to clear the entire peak itself, as the defenders were scattered throughout and ready for them in anticipation of their arrival over the crest. The ones on the edge of the peak firing down at the Ch1nese were being KIA'd little by little, with now the remaining Americans not eliminated starting to retreat further into the peak, seeking better positions along with the others already hiding. It was about to become very intense indeed. Bill steadied his nerves for what he knew was soon to be inbound. End of part 21.